While headlines focus on tariffs and trade tensions, there's another aspect to this story: reshoring. U.S. companies are now looking even more resolutely to rebuild on American soil. Today, we'll explore how this reshoring revolution could reshape portfolios and potentially redefine America's economic future. We're going to get into the details right here on UBS Trending. Hi again, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Anthony Pastore, and this is UBS Trending. My guest in the studio with me is Moritz Pott, founder and CEO of Tema ETFs. Moritz, good to have you back in the studio.
Anthony, thanks for having me on the show today.
Yeah, thank you. I read your recent report on tariffs and reshoring. Boy, the timing of getting you in here couldn't have been any better. Where we're sitting right now, the markets are very volatile. There's a lot of uncertainty around the tariffs because they go on, they come off, there's new dates. So we won't get into the specifics because it can change at a moment's notice. But I thought maybe I could just sort of say to you, to kick off this conversation and the research you're doing, the reshoring aspect is really interesting, bringing U.S. manufacturing and production back here on American soil. How have the tariffs and the reshoring connections and discussions been going?
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very timely question. And what we see is underlying Trump's tariff agenda is a focus on made in America, America first. And at the heart of that, that means bringing jobs, manufacturing, innovation, investment back to American soil. Not to our neighbors in the north or our neighbors in the south, but back to the US.
Right.
And what that really leads to is an acceleration in reshoring announcements, reshoring activity, and frankly, reshoring prospects. And we've really seen that just in the number of job announcements over the past year already. Just the step up is immense. Now, this is not something that just started last quarter. This has been going on for a number of years. We see reshoring under the guise of a bigger trend, also known as deglobalization, where we see growing fractionalization between countries, which makes trade more expensive, which makes trade more complex, and frankly is leading companies to say it may be more expensive to produce at home today, but it's more secure, and ultimately I have less uncertainty. I'd rather take that, de-risk my supply chain, even if it comes at a slightly higher financial cost.
Right. I think many of us can remember that during the pandemic and the heart of the pandemic, the supply chain issues were really prevalent. I mean, that's why the shelves in so many grocery stores for everyday consumer goods were empty. These tankers were stuck offshore. Obviously, that would not be an issue if we were creating most of our goods and services here in the United States. So give us an example then of where you see potential reshoring opportunities in the U.S. We were just talking about things like semiconductors, where outside the U.S. is where most of them are made, very few here. But it seems like there's momentum kind of building.
So we see reshoring expanding to a wider array of industries, but clearly the administration is focused on some of the more strategic and sensitive industries first. And one of those includes semiconductors. TSMC already opened a massive $40 billion plant in Arizona last year, which again was after 2-3 years of work. These are big commitments. You don't turn on a big reshoring project overnight. You're making commitments for decades, which ultimately take a number of years to bring online. So we've started to see it in areas like base manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, defense manufacturing. We're starting to see it in pharmaceuticals. We're starting to see it in parts of just consumer. So I think in general, what we're seeing is that the number of industries where reshoring is playing a role is growing. Under Trump, reshoring is a mandate. Under Biden, it was a choice. And as it now moves from being an option to being a mandate, companies are getting on the front foot about reshoring in terms of their announcements, in terms of their capital commitments, and also the speed with which they're looking to onshore production. And we've seen several major announcements in the past month alone of companies announcing big multi-year products. So if you look, for example, the Apple factory announcement, which happened 2 weeks ago, that's a big, big commitment. It's multi-year, it's big dollars, and frankly, that's a real commitment. We're going to move production away from China, even away from India, back to the U.S.
Yeah. The question I think that comes up for a lot of folks, and we're learning more and more about tariffs, about how it impacts not only the country that's exporting their goods, but also the consumer that's paying on the other end. What about the long and, so I would say short and long-term impacts of tariffs and then reshoring? Because obviously labor here is going to be a little bit more expensive than overseas. So how does that play into how you think about the long-term impacts?
So I think undeniably, when you relocate supply chains, that leads to volatility and uncertainty, which will have short-term economic impacts, which could be somewhat concerning or potentially somewhat volatile. But if we look beyond the initial short term, I think by the midterm, companies will have much better visibility and security over their supply chains. And also, as we see inflation pick up, which is inevitable in the short term, we actually think that some of the cost differences or cost arbitrages why people offshored 20 years ago are only going to narrow. So as supply chain security goes up, financial arbitrage goes down, I think it becomes a much clearer and much easier choice. But undeniably, there will be volatility and friction in that transition phase. And I think it's inevitable that the government will see inflation pick up at some point in the near future in response to some of these tariff announcements, but also actual tariffs coming in.
Yeah. We've got an interesting chart that you provided for us talking about that when China entered the World Trade Organization in the late 90s, you did see industrial production kind of stall out a little bit here in the U.S. And I could imagine that that's where a lot of this research that you are doing at TEMA with your team is coming from when you look at the impact of what happens when we're not maybe getting so many goods from China, we're getting them more from here.
Correct. So we spend a lot of time really looking at the implications of reshoring, the signs of reshoring, but also like how reshoring is manifesting itself across different supply chains, different industries in different ways. And I think tariffs is one of the latest catalysts or one of the latest accelerants, but it's by no means the only catalyst or accelerant. This trend has been going on for a number of years. And I think what you see in this chart is that there was a period of time when, frankly, the industrial complex in the US was underinvested in, and productivity and output, frankly, didn't accelerate. But I think we're now actually seeing a rapid acceleration in both investments, i.e. inputs, but also outputs, productivity.
Right.
And we think that's going to accelerate and continue. And again, this is really under the guise of this is a focus on made in America, America first. Let's protect ourselves, protect our consumers, protect our supply chains.
And we're looking even at these, you mentioned some of them, these mega project announcements that in the first quarter of 2023, you were looking at about a $600 billion price tag. It's all the way from fourth quarter of last year, $1.7 billion. It's a huge increase, and I'm imagining that number is just going to keep going higher.
Yeah, so we kind of see it accelerating just in the first quarter of this year. And I think you see a number of companies that realize, they're not going to second guess what tariff will come for how long at what price. Listen, we're just going to make a commitment back to the US, irrespective of what happens with tariffs. Because I think the reality is that what we know is tariffs will come. What we don't know is with what speed, with what size, and how they will be applied relatively between countries. I think it's clear that some countries that in the early phases of this policy have had more of a focus on the tariff policy, but we wouldn't be surprised to see tariffs brought into more industries and more countries in the coming months.
It's a very compelling story. So just to wrap it up with you, Moritz, you mentioned Made in America right at the top of the show. How does that sync up with reshoring and tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, Made in America is really focusing on investing and producing and manufacturing locally. And ultimately, reshoring is one of the biggest drivers of bringing back manufacturing to Made in America.
Right, and deglobalization, as you said.
Deglobalization.
Right.
So deglobalization, I think, thinks about the risks associated with your manufacturing outside of your home country. I think Made in America is incentives that are provided by the government or prioritization to bring manufacturing back home. And I think we've seen some acts in the past few years that came and went. But what's interesting, some of the acts that are currently under review, the majority of the money has actually already been spent. And ironically, the CHIPS Act, as an example, the majority of the money was actually spent in red states. So we are not worried about whether the CHIPS Act could or may not be repealed. We think there will be an act that follows, even if it's a slightly different act. What's clear is that the government is very strategic, but also is very focused on enabling companies and investors to come back to this country.
Right. As you said, the short-term impacts are there will be some volatility and a lot of the uncertainty that the market really doesn't like, but hopefully in the long term we'll start to see the benefits of what's happening, and then things might try and calm down a little bit.
I think people are accepting short-term volatility for mid-term security.
Right.
And
Excellent.
I think that's the kind of trade-off that people are, the government is accepting, and I think the government is pressuring companies to accept as well.
Sure, exactly. We also have a terrific Made in America report that our Chief Investment Office has done a lot of research on. I'm sure it probably matches a lot of what you and your team have also seen in your digging through some of the numbers and the strategies and the research that goes along with that program.
Yeah, so we released a report last month about tariffs and reshoring, and we're actually releasing a report this week about powering Made in America. So what are the resources, what are the policies required to really enable the Made in America focus from the current government?
Excellent.
So yeah, we really focus a lot on bottom-up research and research in the field with experts, including our own team.
Terrific. Moritz, thank you so much. Great discussion, very, very timely. Lots to look forward to over the next couple of months into the next year. So glad you could drop by. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me, Anthony.
Of course, Moritz Pot. Again, he is the founder and CEO of Tema ETFs, a terrific partner for all of us here at UBS. And there's lots more information on our website, including everything that Moritz and I discussed and more. Visit our website, ubs.com/views. Plus, you can follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. You can check out our studios channel at UBS Trending. It's right there on your screen, so please give us a follow there. And as always, if you have any questions about your portfolio or would like to access any of the reports that we spoke about today, make sure you're chatting with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. We wish you a great rest of your day. And remember to keep your eyes on what's trending. See you soon, everybody.